want to welcome you all to the 28th Quarterly Northeast Digestion Roundtable meeting hosted by Northeast Biosolids and Residuals Association. And since April 2016, NEBRA has been sponsoring these quarterly meetings to share technical and operational experience and advance best practices on anaerobic digestion. This isn't really, it's more of a meeting and not in a roundtable format, not a webinar. So we will have a presentation and then we'll open it right up for questions and discussions. And I know the presenters will appreciate feedback and engagement. Everyone is not muted, so please mute yourself right now. There should be a chat function available if you want to post things in there. I'll keep an eye on that. The session is being recorded and I'll get you a copy of the slide presentation and the recording link next week. So today we're going to hear from National Grid, an energy utility with some progressive programs for wastewater utilities. And as you know, there is definitely a water energy nexus, and we're all on the same team when it comes to reducing our carbon emissions. So we may be able to talk a little bit about Massachusetts Clean Heat Standard today. That's a policy that is transitioning the Commonwealth away from fossil fuels. And joining us from National Grid, have you guys turn on your cameras. We have Mike McDonald, John Carlin, and Brian Barkwell. And I checked, and everyone except Brian has a LinkedIn profile, so I'm not going to spend time on introductions. Brian, you can introduce yourself a little bit when you get to speak there. All right. But as I said, this is intended to be more of a meeting or a roundtable, so we definitely want to leave time at the end to open it up for questions. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'll have Brian take over.
Surely. Give me one second.
The driver's seat there.
Okay.
Thanks for being with us, guys.
Okay. Thanks, Brian. Janine, thanks so much. It's great having you as a partner. And I love hearing the energy water nexus coming from a wastewater utility. So I've got water and energy here today. And what we want to do is talk about anaerobic digestion in the context of some policy that's occurring in Massachusetts right now. The focus will be mostly on technical, the engineering aspect, and the interconnection aspect. So we'll curve back a little bit on the policy side, but it is something worth understanding and knowing because it provides some context for how the wastewater industry can actually participate in helping shape the future of decarbonization in Massachusetts. Go ahead, Brian. So this is, by the way, Brian, I got a couple of animations in here. So if you just hit the arrow, the next one will come up. All of this really started 20 years ago with the Global Warming Solutions Act, and a number of policy initiatives and legislative initiatives had led up to a couple big pieces of information, large reports that were put out by the state of Massachusetts, a 2030 and a 2050 decarbonization plan. And that really laid out a roadmap, a high-level general roadmap for how the state of Massachusetts is going to decarbonize. From that, a Clean Energy Commission was developed, and that's been comprised of a number of stakeholders, of energy users and different industries and agencies within Massachusetts. And the Clean Heat Commission got together and developed an overarching strategy for how to move forward with designing policy. So what's important here is that overarching strategy really brings into play that this decarbonization effort is going to need a range of policies, a wide array of complementary policies to get to 2050. And so from there, that has been passed off to the Massachusetts DEP, who is currently working on policy as we speak. And they are soliciting comments. They want to hear from all stakeholders. They're looking for public participation in this. So once we go through a couple more slides, we can get into that a little bit more. Go ahead, Brian. But essentially, this is what the gas network is going to look like in 2050. It's going to shrink down from about 800 plus terabtus down to about 180 or so. So much smaller gas network, much more targeted to those hard to electrify customers. And going back to that complementary set of technologies, also inclusive of biofuels and other ways to achieve that goal. Go ahead, Brian. And so this illustrates what the electric side is going to look like. So if you think about the gas side and the heating, all those molecules are now going to the electric grid. So the peak demand on the electric grid moves from the summer to the winter time because all of the heating is now being done electrically. So it's a gigantic shift in paradigm, in technologies, in how to get from point A to point B. And that is all being looked at right now in the clean heat standard. So just a couple of factoids here then. The peak customer demand is going to be more than twice what it is now. It's going to be in the winter instead of the summer. We'll be connecting at least twice the amount of energy, 10 times the renewable energy, 75 times the number of EVs, 100 times the number of heat pumps. And the clean heat standard right now is very focused on heat pumps. And we'd like to see a little more engagement from stakeholders like the wastewater industry and some other hard to electrify industries to bring some perspective to that. Some of these industries are very hard to electrify, or just simply not ready for heat pumps yet. And all of this has to be done by 2050. Next. And so if we think about how the wastewater industry can participate in that, it really is a synergy in a lot of areas. It's consistent with the solid waste management plan in Massachusetts. It helps reduce the volume of biosolids, and tipping fees are a huge issue right now. So there's 2 boxes that are checked off, and it can also really help decarbonize the state of Massachusetts. And if done correctly, and a clean renewable gas is developed and injected into the fuel system, into the gas network, then a lot of money can be made also. So there's a revenue stream there also. So understanding the context of the clean heat standard and where it might be in 20 or 30 years might help in looking at current projects that you have, your capital improvements plan, and how this might play into it. And so, of course, co-digestion comes into that also. 3 times the energy potential is biosolids. And what we love to see with presentations like this is this interdisciplinary and collaborative approach with the wastewater industry and other large industries also. And just as a final note on scale, it used to be that 10 MGD was sort of the cost effective, the economic cutoff point for whether or not a anaerobic digestion treatment train is viable. That dropped down to 7, then it went down to 5. And just as a matter of reference here, there's this facility up in Vermont, Essex Junction, that handles 2 MGD and is able to generate close to 0.5 megawatt hours per year. And just some numbers down there on wastewater and some of the statistics on that. So that's it. And I just want to say, feel free to chime in or ask questions at any time. Like Janine says, this is pretty casual. But at this point, I'm going to pass it off to Brian, who's going to talk a little bit about the engineering aspect. Thank you. Oh, yeah, I should just say, if you're interested in engaging with the clean heat standard, here's the link. Janine, I'm guessing you're going to have this posted somewhere, so you can click onto that link or just go onto the DEP website.
Yeah, I can post it on the Netter page. I can post it a bunch of places. And I'll just mention here that NEBRA has submitted some formal comments, and we're going to keep following this policy development here in Massachusetts.
Great. Thanks, Janine. Off to you, Brian.
All right. So the engineering process for biogas and RNG. So Biogas is typically produced from anaerobic digesters, landfills as well, which act similarly. There is gasification as well, but predominantly biogas is going to come in about 600 BTU per cubic foot. That's because of the fraction of methane to CO2. To bring it up to pipeline quality, which National Grid quantifies as at least 975 BTU per standard cubic feet, you're going to require basically 98% roughly methane in the product. There's limits in terms of how the inerts, hydrogen sulfide, and other gas constituents that need to be conditioned prior to injection. So in addition to removing the CO2 and purifying the methane concentration, we need to kind of remove some of these more hazardous gas components that would potentially impact customers or gas network. And the idea of the system that we would have is that we would allow developers or utilities to interconnect with our pipeline, let our customers be predominantly the offtake for your gas produced, and allow you to participate in the low carbon fuel system credits or RINs for the D3 and D5 RINs as part of the renewable fuel standard. There is a voluntary credit market that's developing, so that's kind of something you're more than welcome to explore. Traditionally, the starting prices are going to mirror that of a RIN in the renewable fuel standard. Okay, so basically, this is a relatively simplified process flow diagram of a wastewater treatment plant that's also considering food waste. So you're going to get some food waste, you have to strip it with contaminants, you have to remove the plastics, other things like that. You're going to produce an organic slurry. There's typically some type of maceration process that is also designed to strip out metals and plastics. And ultimately, you're going to put it into an anaerobic digester. The liquid train of the wastewater treatment plant, mostly primary, but possibly secondary solids as well, are typically thickened and then brought to the anaerobic digester where you're going to produce biogas and biosolids. The biogas you can flare, you can condition to produce RNG, and you can also do CHP where you produce electricity off that biogas. For the biosolids, there's a little bit of contention about the best thing for biosolids, but I'm still a big proponent of land application, particularly as long as they meet the requirements of SRT, Class A, Class B. And so I think that's a big part of the circular economy. And like I said here, co-digestion is important if you are looking to both reduce your carbon footprint of the neighboring area and also maximize your biogas production. And fats, oils, and grease are also a huge proponent of this. They are more carbon dense compared to some of the other materials that would be in food waste, allowing you to significantly increase gas production. They do come with some headaches because they float to the top. They obviously need to be well mixed. In handling, fats, oils, and grease, if you are familiar with scum or skimmings, can get a little messy too. So you do need to be careful about the percentage of fog that you would put into your anaerobic digester. For conditioning systems, there's a couple of different options out there. The three largest you're going to see are a membrane system, which is essentially a bunch of spaghetti with pores that are designed to specifically target all the materials outside of methane. So allowing a series of these systems to strip out what's unwanted versus what's desired. A pressure swing absorption system is a similar concept. You pressurize a vessel, you allow the pressurization to mechanically strip the methane from the unwanted constituents. The vessels are filled with media that is designed to the angstrom level so that CH4 cannot adsorb onto the heart of the media. They can only absorb onto the outside, allowing CO2 to strip quite effectively. We have a PSA system at our facility in Newtown Creek. There's also other systems like solvent scrubbing, which typically uses some type of amine stripping system that you see similar to natural gas sweetening to remove hydrogen sulfide. So to interconnect with our gas pipeline, this is going to be a standardized one-line diagram. It's worth noting that things can shift depending on the site and the size of the system. But predominantly, we're going to have 3 steps to confirm gas quality. We have a GC, or gas chromatograph, that's going to track BTU content, CO2 content, methane content, etc. We also track oxygen and nitrogen. We have a sulfur analyzer that's confirming whether or not the hydrogen sulfide limits in the product gas meet our gas quality requirements, and a moisture analyzer just to ensure water never exceeds acceptable limits. We regulate it. We also inject odorant to make sure that in the event of a leak, people understand the smell that they're identifying as a gas leak as opposed to a rotten egg smell that's typically associated with hydrogen sulfide. We're going to meter it. And then we have our final flow control valve, which basically says, is it worth, is the gas quality confirmed by the 3 analyzers that I discussed before? If it is, we'll allow you to flow into our system. If it's not, we're going to either deadhead the system or recycle the gas back to the conditioning system. So RINs, this gets into a little bit of how you can sell environmental attributes produced. RINs, or otherwise known as renewable identification numbers, are essentially a gallon equivalent under the renewable fuel standard. So the most typical way this works is when the program first started, it was designed for something like ethanol, where you probably have gone to a gas pump before and you've seen contained 10% ethanol. There was a limit to what ethanol was able to do. And so they started opening it up to other fuel supplies, and renewable natural gas typically quantifies as D3. D5 is food waste, and there's a reason why it's a lower value. It's because they didn't want to create a market for wasting food to make money. The D3 and D5 RINs are sold on the RFS market, where obligated buyers, people like ExxonMobil, are required by the state, required by the government. There's a renewable volume obligation for obligated parties to buy these attributes. And so they are a marketed commodity. They are traded every year. They fluctuate in value because they are a traded commodity. You can track their value. COVID did cause some instability in the market, just like it did for natural gas prices. But the EPA assumed control of the program in 2022. Congress had ran it for the 20 years prior. And under the EPA, they're trying to stabilize RIN values so that they are much more predictive for developers. So currently they're targeting about $2.50 to $3 a renewable identification number, which translates roughly to about $30 per MMBTU. So how do RINs work? You're going to produce the biogas, condition it to renewable natural gas quality, and you would inject it into our pipeline, allowing you, showing that you had beneficial use. The RIN credit can be separated from the commodity and then sold to any obligated party. So you are able to basically sell it to whomever you'd like without an issue. This gets into the RIN classifications as I was discussing before. Biogas is going to predominantly be D3. So that's going to be your cellulosic breakdown of material in an anaerobic digester. D5 is the thing I was discussing before, where food waste, because they want to depress the value of wasting food, does come at a reduction from the D3 equivalent. It is worth noting that the low carbon fuel credits from California are a stackable credit. So when you're making your $30 per MMBTU, you are still eligible to sell to California for an additional credit. It's going to depend on your CI score or your carbon intensity value. For wastewater treatment plants, it's a modest. It's for Newtown Creek, we get about $9 to $12 additional per MMBTU for the low carbon fuels. So this is the D3. So what we're seeing here are the congressional volume targets for renewable fuels. What you can notice most is that cellulosic is where the most amount of growth is seen. As I said before, ethanol was the primary pathway in the beginning, and then it simply reached a capacity in terms of what it could do. Cellulosic, or RNG, is where things are starting to explode. As I said, Congress owned the system till 2022. EPA has set significantly more aggressive targets so that these numbers continue to grow, with RNG being the most aggressive in terms of expansion. Let's keep going. I've already kind of touched on this, but D5 RINs do have a depressed value. It's worth noting that from a utility perspective, we're not able to buy the RNG credits currently. So that's something that is definitely worth noting, there's no currently program in Massachusetts to encourage RNG production. The MA Clean Heat Standard provides some framework, but currently RNG is a little bit discouraged because they're trying to push the program towards electrification. And this is something that we are looking to provide comment on. You know, Niebuhr mentioned it before. This is something we're actively trying to promote the benefits of renewable natural gas, both from a carbon benefit standpoint, where New York City has leaned heavily into gas to grid, as they note it. And they're doing that also with a massive expansion of their food waste. So they're going to be taking food waste into 4 or 5 different wastewater treatment plants over the next 10 years, drastically reducing the city's carbon footprint, as well as maximizing gas use via the natural gas network in the city, to make a fair bit of profit as well. And with that, if you're curious about more, I'm going to pass it on to John, who's going to explain how you would discuss a potential interconnection with National Grid.
Thank you, Brian. This is really the crux of what I'm presenting, is this link. I want you to go to this URL if you have a project or are interested in developing a project or have some questions about a project. You know, Mike went through the policy, Brian went through the technical piece. I'm the bureaucratic steps, the really fun stuff, you know. So next slide, Brian. So when you go to the website, there's going to be 3 major pieces to it. There's a quick introduction with a link to submit a pre-application. It's if you have an address, you're interested in finding out more about that address, you submit that, give us some specifics about what you're looking to do, and that'll get it into our system, and we can start that conversation developing, you know, a solution for getting your gas into the distribution network or into the transmission network. We also have a what is RNG, where you can look up, you know, some of the specifications that differentiate biogas from RNG, the heating value, the moisture content, how much CO2, et cetera. There's a more robust set that's significantly longer of what those specs are, but these are the key factors that producers should be aware of. And then the third piece of the website is our question form. You can submit questions, and it's a catch-all for RNG. I field that inbox, and I make sure that we get those questions answered. And then I'm going to go briefly into the pre-application process, what we're looking for. So there's contact information, who's submitting the pre-application, and how should we reach back out to you. Then the next, once you get the contact information, apparently I didn't include the, no, it's fine. After that contact information is submitted, there's a few project specifics. If you don't have all of those specifics yet, the biggest thing that we need is an address and confirmation that you are aware of that 975 BTU per CFM requirement for RNG going into our system. Here's a higher look at a broadened look of the forum input form. So name, address, phone number, what's your question, what's your comment, and then please don't be a robot, and you can send us your question. And as I said, we'll get that fielded. And so that's the website on a broad scale, and that is the funnel for any projects into our interconnection process. Next, I'm just going to show you the outline of what an interconnection process is. Once we've intaked your project, it's going to go into the preliminary evaluation phase, where we screen it. We get your project information. We find out about how much gas you're expecting to generate and inject, how much you're planning to consume. So what's the net difference on our system? And then we're going to take that to our planning group and ensure that the system that we're looking at is able to take that and come up with a solution that the gas that you're planning to generate can make it into our system. That's the screening piece. Once we get that screening back or that response back from our planning group, we'll come back to our customers with it, whoever's proposing this project. And once we get their agreement, we'll progress things to the feasibility analysis. This takes the form of a 60% design. It's done through an engineering services agreement. And that will illustrate all of the inputs for the final agreements, the FCRA, GSA, and O&M agreement. So the FCRA is the Facilities Construction Reimbursement Agreement. Got that right, Brian?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. I was a little worried on that acronym. Then GSA is the Gas Sales Agreement, and the O&M agreement is the Operations and Maintenance Agreement. Does NGrid pay these interconnection design costs? No. Grid is not able to pay for the studies. All of that falls on the generator, the producer. We don't have funds for that. So the FCRA is the agreement on what construction is required to do the interconnection. The GSA is the agreement on how are the brown gas, how is the brown gas going to be handled, and then the O&M agreement is the agreement between grid and the customer on how the interconnection equipment is going to be operated and maintained. Basically, we operate and maintain it, and the customer is required to pay for it. Once those agreements are done, we go into the design and construct phase. Final agreements are executed. Those 3 agreements, those are executed, construction begins, and then it's startup and O&M. And that's the broad, with a really broad stroke, what the process is. And if there are any questions on that, I'm happy to answer those. That's what we have this morning. And now, we want to leave plenty of time for conversation about the process. These are just useful links that I thought would be good for you to have when these go out. It's the NGA interconnect guidelines, which our process is based on, as well as the link to our webpage.
I do
Yeah,
see
great.
there's a couple of questions in the chat.
All right,
okay.
I think it was just me saying, fair enough. You're gonna pay to operate. You take it over after, but all right. So we do have some questions coming in. I'll just read them out loud for the group. One is, what percentage of the gas supply is RNG, and what will it rise to or could rise to? Do you know that, you guys?
Yeah, so a percentage of gas supply is going to be a function of demand, right? So right now it's less than 1%, and that's because of how high consumption is for natural gas. As we start shifting customers to electrification, that percentage is going to grow, and we also believe that the amount of projects in RNG are going to continue to grow. So if you look at the RNG Coalition's website, has a lot of great resources, but in the last 6 years, I think we've 5x'd the number of projects that are online and producing RNG. So we'll say that the field is growing in terms of RNG production. At the same time, we're hoping to see consumption come down.
Yeah, I'd love to see that 1% grow. But if I had been a betting person, that's the number I would have said. I knew it was pretty low right now.
Yeah.
There was a second part to that question too, and probably for John. How long does the interconnection take, and are there any response times mandated?
Currently, there is no tariff There's no legislation around timelines for responses. We work because the number of projects is so small. All RNG projects have direct access to me, and so the response times, I endeavor to keep them as small as possible, but there's still work that needs to be done. As for how long does an interconnection take, the estimate that we're using is 3 to 5 years currently.
Okay.
It's worth noting, when we add supply, we do just need to run it by regulatory. And so there's a QA process potentially that could hold it. Most of the time, we can have our interconnection done so that as you're building your RNG system, we're never your time limiting step. So there is a project on Long Island, for instance, where they're doing food waste to RNG. That facility, we have a truncated construction schedule that more closely aligns with how they're installing and constructing their conditioning system. So we can come down. We aim to never be the thing that's slowing you up. Usually, it's going to be permitting and things like that take the longest for RNG projects, and we kind of just follow your project schedule.
So you've been working at this for a while. It seems like it's a much smoother system than I've heard it was in the past. So
we have had some lessons learned, maybe the hard way, with our own RNG pilot at Newtown Creek in New York City. So we've both shifted how we designed the RNG interconnection system. We're trying to bring the costs for that system down. We're trying to bring the complexity of the system down, and we're trying to make it a system that we can replicate much more simply, which also helps reduce the construction schedule.
And hopefully that will be, I know there's been some issues with interconnecting for electric, and there are a number of issues around that. You have a solar field maybe 5 miles away from the grid, or some other distributed generation that requires transmission to the grid from the solar field, or whatever it might be. Then you have storage issues with that. Hopefully this interconnection process is not going to be as onerous or complex. And I will say that John's group is a newly formed group in National Grid, strictly focused on addressing interconnection for RNG.
yeah, terrific.
Mark asked 2 very good questions. I'm going to
All
take
right.
the second one first, because this is actually something I should have quantified on the call during my presentation. Previously, if you put even a drop of food waste into an anaerobic digester that had either dairy manure or wastewater sludge, you would have devalued the value of your RNG gas from D3 to D5. The renewable fuel standard was recently updated to do it on a mass loading basis. There's a couple more hoops you got to jump through, but it's no longer going to penalize you in the way that it did before. So for instance, at Newtown Creek, they have 8 digesters, 4 of which receive food waste, and the other 4 just do sludge. Previous to the rule change, 50% of the gas production roughly was going to be devalued. Now it's done on mass loading, which is roughly between 18 and 24% food waste, which is a huge difference in terms of our financials. So that's kind of how the D3, D5 thing was more or less resolved. It's just going to be on a mass loading basis. The second, for the grid and the electrical use and how many homes, what you're asking is the $1 million question, probably billion or $1 trillion question, is going to vary depending on the existing system. So some networks you have some quirkiness in terms of the electrical systems, the substations, what they're operating at. Each one's going to require a different thing. It's also going to be important to understand where your new energy supplies are coming from. If it's renewable, offshore wind, for instance, is going to be a huge thing in the Northeast. New York and Massachusetts are both leaning heavily into it. That's going to change how electricity now needs to be distributed. And so it's a hard question for me to quantify without saying it's going to be expensive. And you're starting to see a bunch of utilities basically start proposing different plans for what substations need to be upgraded and how that's going to happen. And that's going to come with a cost.
Yeah, that comes with very, very true. It comes with a very high cost and a lot of complexity. There are a number of issues when you dig into this. And like Brian said, this is really the big issue. How is it going to be done? And how can it be done in order to meet the time frame? And this is where that mix, that portfolio of an array of different options comes into play. So if you think about electrifying tomorrow, just as an extreme, just ask yourself, would you be able to fully electrify your building by next year? Most of the time, the answer is, yeah, we really either haven't looked at it or we have looked at it and it's just really expensive, and we're concerned about winter peak temperatures, or maybe the cost of rolling over to full electrification. I mean, there are a number of issues that come up with that, reliability. All of that has to be addressed. And honestly, it's early stages. We're really just looking at this in the very early stages. National Grid has recently submitted an energy strategic management plan to the Department of Public Utilities that is currently under review. And that's public information. I can, send it or post it, or, whoever's interested can just shoot me an email. But it is public information if you Googled it. And that essentially has the strategy laid out in it. So it'll be a number of issues that would have to change dramatically. So it's just a paradigm shift in the grid with storage, connectivity, property rights. When you start looking at bringing transmission lanes,
it's complicated.
Yeah, very, very and extremely expensive also. So that's the big question. Yeah, that's the big question.
All right, I'm gonna stop so we can see each other, because we have some more good questions here from Alex. I don't know if you want to just ask them yourself, Alex. If not, I think this is probably a question for Brian.
Just all FYI on food waste, what we've been kind of doing in Vermont with the question of depackaging. So, I sit at the Agency of Agriculture. Our people got freaked out when depackaging came along, because this waste is presumably, after the digester, maybe going to be spread on the land. And so it gets into like, what's in it, right? The same issue you have with biosolids, what's in it? And so there was a whole process. I was on the edge of that process. We were represented in that process to make a recommendation. I posted all the links there, and that's all. Just like the fact that there's plastic in it changes, I think, is going to change what you can do with it on the output side. And then the other thing is just like, I've seen these, the food waste thing is super tempting and the business ends up being pretty risky. I've seen it not work, and that's a bummer. So anyhow, there's some things to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. But we do have a great success story from around here, and there's a recorded version of it on that Netter website there, the Greater Lawrence Sanitary District, which has done it. But they get a food slurry that has a facility nearby, kind of almost not very far at all, and they truck it over.
I was just about to say the same thing, Janine.
Basis, so, and I don't know what you do. Are you taking waste at Newtown Creek? Food waste?
Yep. Yeah. So New York City DEP basically issued an RFP for potential food waste suppliers. They call it engineered biosolids. It has to meet certain qualities. There's a holding tank. There's periodic inspections as well, but there's a holding tank. And then they do one step further where they'll run it. They'll pump it through a screen press, similar to how you deal with solids. They'll do that to basically make sure, if you're not familiar with the screen press, it's like a rotary screw that you press through it. And so it's able to capture some potential impurities that could potentially get through. Although my understanding is that Waste Management has been doing a pretty exceptional job for the engineered biosolids.
Yeah, there's specifications for it that they have to meet, that GLSD set up. So
it can help bring down the headaches that come with it.
Right.
I like you. We have a behind the meter pilot actually with schools who can put food waste into a miniature anaerobic digester to basically offset some potential natural gas use. And that's my number one concern. When you don't have all these protections, you're going to inevitably build up this plastic, and who's managing it is definitely a huge question.
Yeah, and operating these things is already difficult enough. That's why we don't have more of them. That's the only thing I can think of is we certainly have the energy cost incentives around here to have more anaerobic digesters at wastewater treatment facilities, but I think I can name them on one hand. I don't know.
Yeah.
Vermont has a few more than the rest of the states, but
Doesn't the
Actually,
IRA have some funding available too? for
Absolutely,
anaerobic
yeah.
digesters? Like they'll pay
Yeah, I'm
up to
hoping it'll
50% of the
expand.
cost. Yeah.
oh no, we also, I designed a pilot system at Newtown Creek to take their scum, do the same, heat it so it's a little bit more viscous and you can pump it more easily, and then run it through a screen press so you could actually dose fog into your digesters from what you're producing at the wastewater treatment plant. And then I know someone further explored the concept with a fog receiving station taking brown grease from restaurants, things like that in North Carolina. They presented on it at WEFTEC Biosolids. It was really interesting, but they were doing like 24% fog, which I had never even heard of before.
Wow, that's pretty.
So I don't want to,
That'll
that's
beef up
not
your
my
biogas.
project. Yeah, that's not my project, and I don't want to overinflate potential values, but I did see that presentation at WEFTEC, and I thought that was definitely something to study up on and see if that becomes a pathway to both produce fog, utilize fog as opposed to
Right.
dumping it into a landfill. And obviously you can imagine the biogas implications as well.
Absolutely. All right. We have any more questions or comments here? Let's see.
I threw one up here early on, Janine, just as a
Yeah.
reference point. So the price of natural gas typically hovers around $2 to $3 per MMBTU. And if I heard Brian right, a RIN is in the range of $30 per MMBTU, just as a reference point.
Yep. No, that's helpful.
If you want,
And
I can
I'll
look up
save
a
this
D3
chat.
RIN right now.
Yeah, great. I'd be very interested.
I got to do it on the private computer. Our National Grid
Okay.
computer blocks it, so I'll just be over here for a second.
Yeah, so that's, and we do have other presentations too in the past on some of these topics if you want to dig in more, like RINs and what they're doing in California.
Yeah, I mean, I can touch
We
on
should all be
California.
watching that. Yeah.
So California proposed, and I believe they got a lot of pushback, but they proposed essentially what their plans out to. I think it was 2044, and the idea was it's the 20-year future of the program. In that proposal, it basically called for renewable natural gas to start getting weaned off in 2029, weaning to a gradually lower percentage of what it comprised in the LCFS program up until it would 2039, where it would no longer be allowed to participate. It got an immense amount of pushback. And there's a couple of different aspects to it. First, the one thing that I think most people agree on is that landfills don't really need to participate. Their CI score isn't that great, coupled with the fact that they produce so much. A lot of these landfills that are on the LCFS are some of the most massive projects in the country. They're eating too much of what the supply would be, and what they're trying to do is encourage projects that are doing food waste co-digestion and or dairy manure where their CI scores are the best. They received a lot of pushback. The RNG Coalition, and I'm a member on the board here, met with them and filed comments, and we believe that they're actually going to amend it to at least extend the life of RNG to trickle down up until the 2044 number, with dairy being the last thing, but food waste co-digestion likely being able to participate till I'm going to guess around 2035. They haven't finalized the ruling yet, and so once they do, I'll be sure to share that with NEBRA. But what it's going to essentially establish is that RNG, particularly food waste co-digestion and dairy, have a real future for the LCFS for at least the next 10 years, which means projects that come online, you're going to be grandfathered in part of the ending trickleization as well. And that can have drastic impacts to the bottom line. So like I said, for Newtown Creek, we get about $12 to $16 is the estimate over the next 4 years for our participation in the LCFS market. And conversely, that's stackable, right? So we're getting our $30 to $40 per MMBTU for the RNG credit, meaning we're producing roughly 25 times the value of natural gas when we're selling these environmental attributes elsewhere. And that can translate to a fair bit. Obviously, Newtown Creek is the largest wastewater treatment plant in the city. It produces about 760 decatherms a day. So, it's 220 MGD combined flow, but it's able to get all the way up to, actually during Hurricane Sandy, the plant chief is actually my former boss, and they pumped for 847 MGD. So it's a massive facility, don't get me wrong, although it's like half the size of Deer Island. And, you know, that's capable of producing an incredible amount of gas. But we're forecasted to make upwards of $10 million a year because of that. So the financials are there, and the payback period can be pretty attractive.
So there's going to be a transitional period. We can't just get electrified like that, right? There's going to be this transitional period where we really could have a role in that. And then, so the big pushback is with the gas collection system. Is that the big
The
issue?
is,
Why wouldn't you continue to generate renewable natural gas going forward from a waste resource like food or biosolids?
in a perfect world, they would want you to do CHP and produce electricity with your biogas and be part of the renewable energy solution. Now, New York City DEP has what I think is the most compelling argument against that, which is if you believe that in the future for 2050 that all of your energy in the state of New York or here in New York City, and for you guys up in Massachusetts and Vermont, if you believe that most of your energy will come from renewable sources, you actually have a higher carbon footprint than if you just did solar or wind. Coupled with the fact that you're now tasking a wastewater treatment plant to be essentially a power plant, and they don't necessarily have the expertise. These systems are
That's
incredibly
true.
expensive. Most of the time in my experience when we've operated CHP systems or I've designed CHP systems, we typically have a set it and forget it type of operation where you operate at like 60 to 70% fire, and you basically just turn it on and off. They're never going to modulate it because they don't have the ability to staff it the same way that they need to
And there's
in
really
order
no
to meet
SCADA
their
systems
permits.
for them
Exactly.
right now.
And so what that creates is this situation where you're going to have one probably operating all the time, maybe a second that's turning on and off, but they're both going to be operating at essentially a stable fire rate, producing a stable amount of electricity every time they're on, which means you're not going to maximize your biogas use. You're going to end up potentially flaring. And all these comes at it's also got the greatest capital cost. You're going to spend a lot of money on these expensive systems. So that's New York City DEP's counter argument and why they're aggressively pushing power to gas. You know, it ultimately, I'd like to think that wastewater treatment plants are part of the hard to electrify sector and would comply with Mass 2080, but currently that's not part of it. I would also note that, you know, we haven't really touched on hydrogen at all. And we're currently doing a pilot actually with UMass Amherst where we're producing hydrogen and we're producing oxygen, and we're testing the ability to take the oxygen product from electrification and use it in aeration tanks. So you can take the final pass of an aeration tank and actually make a product of that oxygen coupled with the product from the hydrogen. So there's a lot of interesting things coming into the space. Ultimately, you know, in Massachusetts, Mass 2080 is going to dictate a lot of what we can and can't do. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep innovating and keep pushing it and keep commenting on it.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mass 2080 still, I mean, it's a written policy right now, but the way we're interpreting is there potentially is still some wiggle room in there to be able to inject certain amounts under a certain manner of RNG into the system. And so that's, we hadn't talked about that. That's another policy that's actually been enacted by the DPU. And we're trying to conform to that to the best that we can right now, in addition to the clean heat standards. So you've got all of these different cross currents going on with what we can do with our gas network without a lot of room of consideration for actually using RNG in the network. And that's why it's important really for all customers to get engaged with this. And just as a matter of scale, Newtown Creek is huge. But if we have, I don't know, Janine, maybe you can comment on this a little bit more. There was some discussion earlier with a few of the facilities in Massachusetts about bringing in satellite facilities for waste disposal as well as co-digestion with food. So if you have a number of facilities with a common sludge treatment point, then you get scale with that. Was it 50% of the facilities in Massachusetts, I think, are less than 5 MGD? So most of the facilities are pretty small, but by combining waste at a central location, that can be addressed with scale.
Yeah, regionalization. Another very complicated process, but definitely worth the effort, if I think, especially because of the scale. Mark was asking a good question. That's kind of the question I was getting to with the, is there going to be at some point where it won't be financial, the financials won't make sense to
Obviously, it's
anaerobically
gonna
digest biosolids? I mean,
it's gonna be dictated on how expensive it was to install, right? How big is your system? How much gas are you producing? How much are you able to maximize your profits based on what you're spending? I'll note there are some economies of scale where the larger your system, it's not like if you have a 5 MGD plant versus a 50 MGD plant, the RNG system's not going to be 10 times more expensive, right? So the bigger it is, you actually end up seeing probably a higher payback. That's not to say that it would be a deal breaker. For most RNG systems, I would put it in the range of like, it's going to be between 15 and 40 million. And then it's just going to depend on your gas production to figure out the payback period. The RNG systems are they're getting cheaper, they're getting more efficient. The membrane system in particular seems to be the way that most people are going because they are the cheapest. There's things you can do also, like you can capture CO2 and you can sequester it, and there's potential credits there depending on the state. There's also some companies who would look to buy the CO2 from you, whether it's with some type of program to be eligible to, like in the state of New York, you can put CO2 into concrete. You'll make it a little bit more brittle, but it can sequester it, and they get benefits from the state for having a decarbonized concrete. So there's other, financial pathways, but by and large, the selling of the credits should still be able to pay back your system out to 2035. The numbers shift if you don't already do anaerobic digestion. That's worth noting. Although I would like to always kind of preach the idea that if you're not digesting already, RNG might actually help you pay off that system, and then eventually they're probably going to make you produce electricity. That's probably going to be out to 2035, 2040, 2050. Sometime in the future, they'll probably force CHP. But let RNG bankroll the digesters is kind of the way I look at it. So it varies is the answer, unfortunately.
All right. Well, that was a really good discussion, you guys. Thanks again so much for joining us, Mike, John, and Brian. Thanks to everybody. Yeah. And thanks to everybody else who joined us.
If you ever have any questions, you're more than welcome to reach out to us. I'll try and
I'll include your contact information on the follow-up with the link to the recording and also the slide deck. So that'll be great. Just want to mention who's up next in our netter lineup is Ward Jansen's. Maybe some of you are familiar with him. He's with Evergreen Environmental, and he's going to introduce something called CCI Bioenergy, which is a hydromechanical pre-processing system for organic waste. I seem to be seeing a lot more of these mechanical pre-processing systems now for wastewater sludges. So, and they definitely have potential, including possibly addressing some PFAS. So we'll see. That should be an interesting one. And if anybody has any topics you want to have a netter session on, please let me know. You can always email me. Thanks again for joining us, everyone. Have a great Friday afternoon.